class, welcome back to History of Christianity. Last time we looked at Charlemagne and the rise of the Carolingian Empire and the impact that had on the church. And then we started looking at the decay of the church and how things really started going downhill for the medieval church. Today we're going to continue our study of medieval Christianity. We're going to be looking at the rise of Islam and then how the Christians reacted to the Muslims taking the Holy Land with the Crusades. We're not going to look at every single crusade there was. We'll definitely look at the First Crusade and the Third Crusade, the Children's Crusade, but also how that the Crusades impacted the church and how the church came out of the Crusades on the other end of it. So stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
Okay, class, now we're going to have the PowerPoint on against Islam and then the Crusades. Before we get into the going against Islam and the Crusades, I do need to bring up a few things before we move into those two topics. But the first one is monastic reform. We have to always remember that the church was growing in power and the church was spreading its influence around. And while this was going on, there was corruption within the church, and it was seen by the monastic leaders. And it was also beginning to invade the monasteries themselves. And so some of the monasteries began to call for reform within monasteries. And the main reason was within the monasteries, the rule, which was the basic guidelines and almost like the textbook of how to run a monastic order, was being ignored. And so we have rise of this group called the Cluniacs. And they get their name because these were monks who were in the Clooney Monastery, which is in Clooney, France, Clooney Monastery, and they set out to reform itself. And they wanted to really, sharpen up and shape up. And what happens is that the reforms then spread from the Clooney Monastery. And the basis of this was that they declared that the monks or the nuns' job was to praise God. And so what they did was they set hours for prayer and for scripture reading, and it was quite extreme. They would actually sing 138 of the Psalms every single day. So it was a long time of prayer, scripture reading, singing, and it really did reform that monastery. And the corruption left, and they were back on the way that the monastic order should be. But then what happens is after reforming other monasteries, and actually hundreds of monasteries across Europe began these reforms, then the monastic movement set its sights on reforming the church. So the Cluniac influence on the church. There's a couple of bullet points here, a list of the influences that the Cluniacs had. Basically, it was to free the church from any kind of civil authority, and that included appointing offices, so get rid of that. It eradicated simony, which is buying and selling offices. That's a great way to raise a lot of money for someone in the church or even a monastery itself to sell an office. And people would pay a lot of money to be able to have some kind of a position. So it eradicated simony. Celibacy became a pillar for the monasteries and the clergy. So again, this focus on moral living and obviously not getting married, celibacy, it became a pillar for the clergy. Strict obedience to supervisors, and that went all the way up to the Pope. So any kind of disobedience would never be tolerated. There would be some sort of punishment coming if a monk was disobedient, and that went all the way up through the ranks. Monks could own nothing, but what happened was all the wealth was held by the monastery. So the monks were very plain, were very poor, but the monasteries were very wealthy. They had the money, the gold, the land, etc. And because the monasteries fell under the church, by de facto, the church would actually be the one that was holding all the wealth, and the church was very wealthy. Okay, so this is the Clooney Monastery. The drawing is how it was at the height of its power, and you can even see the basilica there in the center of the monastery in the upper left picture right here. You can see the basilica, but this is the only portion that I'm circling on the screen with my little arrow. This is the only portion of the monastery that's original, that is left today. So Clooney Monastery is still there today, and there's all these other later additions added onto it. But this is the only thing that's left from the original monastery. Okay, the East and West Church Schism of 1054. Bulgarian Archbishop accused the Western Church of error, and this was the spark that led to the Schism of 1054. And the Schism of 1054 is where the East and West Church they split and they never reconcile. The issue was that the West made celibacy a universal rule, and this grew into a great controversy. Pope Leo IX sent Cardinal Humbert to Constantinople to deal with this issue. Now, Humbert was an ardent promoter of clerical celibacy, so he was against marriage. And he arrived in Constantinople bent to condemn any married clergy member, especially in the East, that would be in the Eastern Church, any married clergy member as an enemy of the church. And so, I mean, that's a big deal. When the Pope sends a cardinal, the cardinal shows up on scene and basically calls out every single married person that's in the clergy that they're an enemy to the church. Humbert and Michael Cerularius vehemently argued and debated over this situation. And what happened is, on June 16, 1054, as Cerularius was preparing to administer communion in St. Sophia's Cathedral, and that's the main cathedral in Constantinople, Humbert marched in, went up to the altar as the guy is about to do the communion, and he laid a decree of excommunication in the name of the Pope on the altar, declared Cerularius a heretic, walked out, and when he got to the doorway, he stopped, he shook the dust from his feet, and then he went back to Rome. And that act split the church forever, the East and the West. So there was no longer a unified church, basically. They were drifting apart anyway, but the East and West split. The Western Church would become basically what is the Church of Europe, and the issues that take place there. And then the Eastern Church is going to go its own way, and they're going to develop the church over there in the East. Now, there will be obviously a coming together, if you will, because of the Crusades, because the West is going to come into the East to deal with the Crusades, but the church never came back together. It was a complete schism that took place in 1054. Okay, so the Crusades. To Christian Europe, Palestine, which is the Holy Land, had special significance. It was the home of Jesus Christ's birth, home of Jesus Christ. It was the birthplace of the church, and it was a place for pilgrimage. Christians had been going to the Holy Land for a long time and making pilgrimages there. But in the 7th century AD, the Holy Land fell to the Muslims, but the Muslims, they still allowed the pilgrims to do their pilgrimages. So Europeans were still coming into this Muslim land and going to see the sights of Jesus and the birthplace of the church and all of that. What happens in 1000 AD, the Seljuk Turks, which are Muslims, they're from Turkey, they gain power and they control the entire area. And in the 11th century, returning pilgrims to Europe came back from the Holy Land, and they were telling of accounts that Christians were being taxed, that there were road tolls being set up, and the Christians were being taken advantage of, and then there were even stories of Christians being killed. So this caused great alarm in the West as the church promoted these pilgrimages to go see the Holy Land. They were now coming back that the Muslims were attacking Christians. Here's a map of the Crusades. Just keep this in your mind real quick. You can see basically the general direction. So you have the starting place up here in Europe, and you just follow all the arrows down. The First Crusade's the red. the red one here. So they come down, and then down in here is the Holy Land, and this is where the Crusades, basically the battles and all of that take place down here in the Holy Land. But you can see just the different routes that are taken and the Crusades. And there's more than 4. There's quite a few Crusades, but on this map there's only 4 that are mentioned. The big ones are the First Crusade because it's the first, and then the Third Crusade with Richard the Lionheart. The blue one here. Those are the big ones. All right, so call for the First Crusade. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks invade the Byzantine Empire. They beat the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and the Seljuk Turks captured much of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And they continued west, and they threatened Constantinople. Well, in 1095, the Byzantine Emperor, who is now in trouble because the Seljuk Turks are, battling him and beating him, he reaches out to Pope Urban II for some help. And at the Council of Clermont, the Pope calls for a holy war or a crusade against the Muslims. So again, now we have the leader of the church, the head of the church, the vicar of Christ on earth, Pope Urban II, saying we need to go and fight a war against the Muslims. And that's a picture there of the Council of Clermont. Okay, so rationale for the First Crusade. Why did they go? I mean, so the Pope is putting forth his case. Well, here's the reasons why they said they should go: to free the Holy Land from Muslim control, so that's an obvious one, and that they wanted to do that; to allow safe passage for pilgrims; to rescue the Byzantines from the Turks because they cried out for help, and so they go help them. Privately, Urban II wanted to reunite the eastern and western portions of the church. So he wanted to try to reunite that, and basically so that he could try to have more power. They said you could gain spiritual merits, follow Old Testament example of warfare. So, in the Old Testament there were lots of battles, so we can go do this too. And then finally, it could actually stop warring between the feudal lords in Europe, meaning if you had lords in Europe who owned vast tracts of land or areas, even counties or larger, they would have their own defenses. They would have their own little, loyal forces that would basically be like knights, and they would sometimes go fight their neighbor or their someone that they had a problem with, and instead of fighting each other, it was a focus to, hey, let's fight this common enemy of the Muslims down in the Holy Land. So this is the rationale that was given to go on this crusade. Okay, so some general facts. For the Crusades, it was one of the darkest days in Christianity. And even to this day, Muslims, they still use this as a black mark on Christianity because a lot of the Crusaders, they didn't do good things. They were pretty cruel, and so the Muslims used this as a black mark on Christianity. The Crusades lasted from 1096 to 1272, so almost 200 years of Crusades. There were 7 official Crusades, and then there were several other ones that were unofficial. On most Crusades, there was no established leader. Usually there were several leaders from different countries. So, someone will call for the crusade. The Pope would call for the crusade, and let's go down there and do this. But a lot of times there was no one leader. No, it was just kind of like a collection of people, and they would have some leaders within them, but it wasn't like there was like one guy in charge leading the crusade. And so that would obviously bring a lot of problems as the Crusaders moved down into the Holy Land, for who's going to go where, what battles are going to be fought, how battles are going to be fought, all of that. So there was no real established leader on the Crusades. Okay, so now we're going to get into a couple of the Crusades. The first one we're going to look at is called the Peasant Crusade. And this is an unofficial crusade because it actually takes place before the First Crusade. And so the First Crusade was being organized. They were trying to get the First Crusade together to leave for the Holy Land. And it takes time to get all of this together, to get all the knights and all the equipment and all of the things they need to take to get going on the First Crusade. Well, in the meantime, there's this peasant crusade. It takes place from April to October of 1096. And it's led by a guy named Peter the Hermit. And thousands of peasants begin to follow him. And basically what happens is they travel from Europe and they make it past Constantinople. So they made it quite a distance, all the way down to Constantinople. And that's where they met the Muslims, and they were slaughtered. That was it. That was it for this peasant crusade. They went down there and they died. But now we have the First Crusade. So the peasant crusade, not sure what they were doing, but they went down there and then disappeared. But the First Crusade, 1095 to 1099, is one that we do need to talk about, not just because it's the first, but it was also the most successful. Urban II stated it was God's will to retake the Holy Land. And he declared, so this is the Pope saying this, he declared a total remission of sins for all the soldiers that went on the crusade. And then what happened was this declaration of remission of sins was then extended to people who could not go on the crusade, but if they sponsored somebody or paid for someone else to go, then that person who paid the money, they could also have a remission of sins. And so what happens is it comes to this point where the Pope is using spiritual leverage to get people to do what he wanted. So the Pope is kind of expanding his power and saying that he can do this to get people to go along with the crusade. The Crusaders wore robes emblazoned with crosses. And so you see there's some artwork there. You can see the Crusaders, they have crosses on their robes. And 1096, the Crusaders are defeated near Nicaea. So right at the very beginning, they're defeated near Nicaea. But then in 1097, they reorganize. They capture Nicaea, they capture Iconium, and they lay siege to Antioch. And then in 1098, they take Antioch. But then a large Muslim force arrives and they surround the Crusaders. So what happens? So now the Crusaders are in the middle, the Muslims are all around them. So there's this Crusader that has this vision of a holy lance, and this motivates them that they'll have victory. And so the Crusaders surprise attack the Muslims, and the Muslims flee, leaving behind all of their women. And the Crusaders capture them, and so the Crusaders are victorious. And I found it interesting. There's this quote down there at the bottom. After taking the Muslim women, this Crusader here says, "We did nothing evil to them. We just speared them through." That was a Crusader account, how they treated the women. 1099, the Crusaders attack Jerusalem, and they kill soldiers. Obviously, they're fighting the soldiers. They kill soldiers. They kill civilians. They kill men, women, children, Jews. The Egyptian Muslims who came to help the Turks, they killed them. It was just horrific actions by the Crusaders. There's stories of the Crusaders throwing babies off the walls, raping women. They burn people alive. They would cut off people's heads, their hands, and their feet, and make piles of them in the streets. So the Crusaders, I know a lot of times it becomes romanticized, and they're doing a lot of like good things, quote unquote, to free the Holy Land of the Muslims, but really they did some things that were pretty barbaric and brutal. It was, as you see here on the screen there by my arrow moving around, it was the most successful crusade. It showed that the Pope could have a military power, and that would be used and flexed by the Pope basically from then on. And what happens is they established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. So because they were successful and they kind of carved out these little enclaves of European-controlled land in the Holy Land, they solidified that. They built castles, and they set up this kingdom down there called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Several years later, the Muslims would return, and they would recapture much of the Holy Land. But they did not take Jerusalem. So this is the end of the First Crusade right there. So they basically got what they wanted by freeing Jerusalem. We're not going to talk about the Second Crusade. If you're interested in that, you can look it up yourself. But the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, we will talk about. This is the kind of the famous one with Richard the Lionheart. 1187, Jerusalem finally is captured by a Muslim leader called Saladin, and he is heavily supported by Muslims. Saladin was very popular with the Muslims, and he was a strong leader, and he captures Jerusalem. 1187, Pope Gregory VII calls for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. 1189, three kings decide to lead the way: Frederick I of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I, or the Lionheart, from England. 1190, Frederick's army captures Iconium, but he drowns while crossing a river, and his troops end up basically dispersing and going home. Richard and Philip continue on to the Holy Land. Philip attacks Acre, and Richard attacks Cyprus. Richard wins and then joins Philip in the capture of Acre, and Philip leaves Richard in command and departs. He ended up leaving and heading back to Europe. And Richard, he takes this opportunity to execute 2,700 Muslims. He attacks Saladin's army and captures Jaffa. And then in 1192, Richard and Saladin make a treaty. And this is the outline of the treaty. It gave a strip of land down the eastern Mediterranean coast to the Europeans. They would then have this little strip of land on the coast of the Mediterranean. The Muslims would retain Jerusalem, and the Crusader kingdom, the capital, is now moved to Acre. So this was the treaty. So the Muslims were not kicked out of the Holy Land. Instead, they ended up retaining Jerusalem. So the whole point of going down there was to kick the Muslims out of Jerusalem because it was recaptured. Well, the Muslims stayed there, so that failed. And then the Europeans basically just go home. They leave some people there to manage it, but they just go home. 1193, Saladin dies, and the Muslims have internal conflict. So the result of the Third Crusade was that there were minor cities captured, a treaty was signed, and there was no major victory. They did not kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land. So even though it's a famous one, and this is kind of like the Richard the Lionheart, you might think in your mind, Robin Hood, King John, that kind of an idea or time period, and it becomes very romanticized in movies. The Third Crusade had limited success, but as it says there, a treaty was signed, and then no major victory. Here's a map of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. So this is the strip of land that is given to the Europeans, and the little green that's a Muslim castle. The green ones, the blue ones are the Christian castles. So they set up some defenses here, and that would remain until the Muslims finally take over the entire Holy Land. Okay, the Children's Crusade in 1212. And this is a very interesting crusade because of who takes part in it. It's a bunch of teenagers. Thousands of teenagers leave Europe on a crusade to free the Holy Land of the Muslims. And there were two leaders in this one, Nicholas from Germany and Stephen from France. Now, Stephen was only 12 years old. But this movement, and a lot of people think that there were some adults that were encouraging it, and monks were going with them, and all of that. But they believe that only the pure and the innocent could retake the Holy Land, and they looked at the teenagers as pure and innocent. So up to 30,000 teenagers move from Europe, and they travel to Italy, and they come to the Mediterranean Sea. And when they got to the Mediterranean Sea, they expected the sea to part and allow them to continue their journey on dry land all the way across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. And they liken this to the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea on dry land. So here's a picture of the Children's Crusade as they're going along. Well, obviously the Mediterranean Sea did not part, And the children were then looking for a way to get there, and they were promised passage on many ships that were owned by these two guys, Hugh the Iron and William of Porscherus. These two guys said, we'll take you down there to the Holy Land, and the ships depart with all the children, and the children are never heard from again. And what happens is, years later, some of these children escaped. You see down here on this bullet point, accounts of children sold into slavery. This account came from teenagers that escaped years later, and they returned to Europe over the Alps and gave the reports of what took place. But 30,000 teenagers basically disappeared, and that was the end of the Children's Crusade. Okay, so some results of the Crusade. In the end, it enhanced the power of the Pope, because the Pope was able to command, first off, this mass movement of military to go fight a common enemy, which was the Muslims. But the Pope had power to influence the kings to go do this. He brought in the power to remit sins if you go on it, and other people, if you pay for it, your sins are forgiven. So it just enhanced the power of the Pope. There was an increase in relics. A lot of times the people would come back from the Holy Land with something, and they would say, well, this is a piece of the cross, or this is a piece of whatever artifact there is, and then people in Europe could pay money to go see it or worship it. There were military monastic orders that came up. Order of St. John. There's one called the Knights Templar, or just the Templars. You may have heard of those, that one. These were monastic orders that they lived a pious life, but they were warriors instead of prayers. I put it like that. So they were not focused on monastic life in regards to living in a monastery, but they lived a pious life, and then instead they were warriors. And so you can see there's a Knight Templar on the right, and he's presumably in the Holy Land, because you see the palm trees and the desert and all of that. And also, in the end, the Crusades combated heresy in the church. And that's it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second.
Okay, class, that's it for today's lesson. Next time, we're going to be looking at the golden age of the medieval church. That does not mean the church was not corrupt. It was still corrupt. But the golden age means it was at its height of its power. And then we're going to transition to scholasticism. So stay tuned for that. Take care.